Hello, my name is Francis Kilkenny. I am a research biologist with the USDA Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station in Boise, Idaho. I will be talking today on restoration plant material development in the Great Basin region of the United States, a history and comparison of research approaches. I'd like to start out with something a little different, with a digression into the philosophy of science. I'm doing this to give you a framework for understanding how conservation science might operate in a given context. Even if you don't recognize Karl Popper, most of you are likely familiar with his ideas. With his 1934 book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery, he helped establish the philosophy of science as a distinct discipline. His main idea was that good scientific theories must be falsifiable, and only those theories that survive many falsification attempts should become established. This is essentially the philosophy that is taught in most science classes. However, science is a human enterprise and may not be as rational as might be ideal. In 1962, Thomas Kuhn published The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he argued that scientific disciplines are constrained by their own conventions, and the types of questions that can be asked depend on these constraints. Thus, science only makes significant progress when newer paradigms overthrow older ones in a type of revolution. This is the so-called paradigm shift that you may have heard about. But some philosophers thought that Kuhn didn't go far enough. Paul Farabeen published his book Against Method in 1975, where he pushed the envelope by arguing that science is in many ways influenced and pushed by many factors, including cultural and political forces, even such things as propaganda. In other words, he recognized that scientific pursuit is often as much about human goals as rationality and logic. This idea is especially pertinent for conservation science, which is applied and outcome-based and very human. I'd like you to keep this in mind as I go through the rest of my talk. The Great Basin region of the western United States, outlined in white on the map, comprises 550,000 square kilometers of area, 75% of which is controlled by the federal government. It has a dry continental climate and is topographically complex, with many ecotones from salt desert to montane forest. Since European settlement, it has faced many environmental pressures, including grazing, annual grass invasions, and increasing wildfire frequency, which has led to the loss of plant and wildlife diversity. Grazing on public lands in the Great Basin rose sharply from the 1880s and peaked in the 1920s. It has declined since then, with sheep and goat grazing declining sharply through the second half of the 20th century, and cattle and horse grazing remaining relatively stable with a slow decline in the late 20th century. This has been due to both regulations that were put into place, mostly beginning with the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, and also to continued ecosystem degradation, which has lowered overall stocking capacity. The Great Basin has been heavily invaded by Eurasian annual grasses, such as Bromus tectorum, or cheatgrass. Cheatgrass began appearing in the Great Basin in the 1890s, and by the 1930s it had invaded every county in the region. Since then, it has continued to increase in abundance in many areas and invade new habitat at higher and lower elevations. Due to early season germination, cheatgrass can outcompete native species at the seedling stage. At high abundance, it also builds up large amounts of fine fuels, which increase fire frequencies. The Great Basin has large rangeland fires. In the United States, the area burned by wildland fire has increased over fourfold since the 1980s, and the Great Basin is no exception. The state of Nevada, which covers most of the Great Basin land area, has seen a doubling in area burned since the 1980s. There is an enormous amount of year-to-year variation. This is driven primarily by fluctuations in cheatgrass abundance in response to precipitation patterns. All of these disturbances have had a significant effect on plant communities and the wildlife that depends on them. Greater sage-grouse are an umbrella species that are highly dependent on intact plant communities. As habitat has continued to be lost due to these disturbances, sage-grouse populations have also declined, indicating the need for ecosystem restoration in the Great Basin. Much of the history of restoration plant material development in the Great Basin can be gleaned from a tale of two research programs. One program of research is focused around the Agricultural Research Service's Forage and Range Lab, and the other around the U.S. Forest Service's Rocky Mountain Research Station. I will begin with the ARS group at the top of the slide. In 1901, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Bureau of Plant Industry was formed. Among other things, BPI was tasked with grazing research and had a heavy focus on forage and pasture species, some of which it tested on wildlands. However, in 1915, BPI's research on public lands grazing was transferred to the U.S. Forest Service's Office of Grazing Studies. BPI continued to develop forage species for use on public lands, but generally did not study the effects of grazing on public lands as a whole. Its main mission was to develop species with the highest forage production value. In 1953, BPI merged with other USDA research divisions to form the Agricultural Research Service. With that consolidation, research on grass and forb plant materials was transferred from Forest Service Research and Development to ARS. Much like BPI before it, ARS, through the Forage and Range Lab in Utah, continued to focus on the forage value of the species it developed. In the Great Basin, this primarily meant that it developed introduced species that produced more biomass than native species, such as crested wheatgrass in the agropyron complex. This route continued until the early 1990s when, perhaps due to outside pressure, the Forage and Range Lab hired its first scientists that worked primarily on native species. The other research group is centered on the Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. In 1910, the Office of Grazing Studies was formed as part of the Forest Service Administration rather than part of R&D, and in 1912, the Utah Experiment Station began on the Manti La Salle Forest, subsequently becoming part of the Rocky Mountain Research Station. Early plant material research was conducted here, primarily to revegetate areas degraded by grazing and soil erosion. In 1926, the Office of Grazing joined Forest Service R&D, and 2 years later, all the experiment stations, including the Utah Experiment Station, were consolidated into Forest Service R&D. After the 1928 consolidation, a series of studies were started at the Utah Experiment Station on native range plants. These studies lasted for over 20 years and made significant progress in developing native plant materials for use in post-disturbance restoration. Unfortunately, in 1953, most grass and forb research was transferred from Forest Service R&D to ARS, and research on native grass and forbs declined. Note that while ARS took on grass and forb research, it did not take up the gauntlet of native species. Forest Service research was directed towards shrubs and more ecological approaches. Over time, RMRS returned to researching native grasses and forbs, but the setback was significant. In this case, organizational decisions made by the federal government had significant impacts on plant material research in the Great Basin. In a 1992 article, members of the Forage and Range Lab threw down the gauntlet by declaring that native species do not work for Great Basin restoration. Here's a quote from Jerry Chatterton, head of research at the time. "Millions of dollars are wasted every year in attempts to reestablish native plants. For years, I've asked to see a successful planting of native plants on more than an acre or two of rangeland. There aren't any." And I can't help but point out that up to 1990, the ratio of non-native seeding treatments to native seeding treatments was a whopping 9-to-1. I'll leave it to you to work that one out. The history of plant material research has had a significant impact on the makeup of species and varieties used in restoration today. In 2015, Ledger and Baughman published a review of the native plant species used in public land restoration projects in Nevada. As part of that review, they cataloged the number of times plant traits selected either in the wild or through artificial selection were mentioned in the release literature. Here's the main graph from their article. I have used arrows to indicate my interpretation of which traits are important for the management objective displayed at the top of the slide. The location and width of the arrows is, in a sense, a metric of the effect that a management objective has on plant trait selection. Here we have range improvement, which has lots of large arrows near the top, suggesting that this objective has historically been of high importance in selecting plant material. Next, we have agronomic production. This isn't as highly weighted as range improvement, but it's up there. Surprisingly, few traits have been selected for soil stabilization and competition with invasives, which is interesting since these objectives are some of the most emphasized in many policy documents. And lastly, while many selected traits can help in long-term plant community restoration, it appears that there has been no systematic effort to select traits for this objective, indicating that it has not been a priority of past plant material development. Now, for a quick whirlwind of the last 30 years. Since the new range war was declared, land management practice has changed significantly, and the science of native plant material development in the Great Basin has exploded, changing more in this time than at any point in the past. Perhaps most ironically, in the 1990s, when that paper was published, a sea change was beginning in seeding practice and more natives were beginning to be used in post-fire restoration. In the early 2000s, the Great Basin Native Plant Project was formed as a partnership between the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, with many outside partners. The Great Basin Native Plant Project has subsequently gone on to support research into over 90 native plant genera. Also in the new century, the scientific debate on plant material development shifted focus somewhat from natives versus non-natives to whether local is best and considerations of genetic appropriateness. In 2014, generalized provisional seed transfer zones were released for the entire United States. These seed transfer zones provide a basis for climate matching for any species that do not already have empirical seed zones. Beginning mostly in the teens, species-specific empirical seed transfer zones were released for workhorse restoration species, including bluebunch wheatgrass and sagebrush. More recently, the use of next-generation sequencing has provided new insights into the biogeography of native plants in the Great Basin, including a better understanding of how commercial releases fit within the genetic diversity of native plant species as a whole. As surprising as it may be, 2019 brought some of the first evidence, because no one had really looked, that native-only seed mixes can be nearly as competitive with invasives as conventional seed mixes. Also in work currently under review, there is evidence that native-only seed mixes have successional trajectories that move toward desired reference states, whereas conventional mixes do not. 2019 also brought evidence that local adaptation is widespread in the Great Basin, but it can also take many years to manifest in some species, indicating that a focus on short-term indicators may be misguided. I believe that the breadth of work in plant material development research today will significantly impact the restoration economy of the Great Basin in the coming years. I also hope that I have convinced you that restoration science is a human enterprise and follows from our values and goals. May we choose wisely going forward.